My name is Amina. I'm 34 years old, and I remember exactly the moment my mother-in-law looked at me across that long glass dining table and said, very calmly, "We didn't think it was necessary to include you in this part." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Everyone at the table heard it. There were 12 of us that night. My husband's family liked things formal, even for small dinners. The table was set with matching crystal glasses, folded linen napkins, and name cards placed in front of each seat. I noticed mine immediately. It wasn't with the others. It was at the far end of the table, not even fully aligned, slightly turned like an afterthought. I didn't say anything. I just walked over, pulled the chair out quietly, and sat down. If you've ever been in a room where you can feel the shift, but nobody acknowledges it, you'll understand what that felt like. If you're listening to this right now and you've ever been placed somewhere you didn't belong on purpose, you probably already know how the rest of that night felt. My husband, Kareem, avoided looking at me. He was seated halfway down the table next to his older brother, already in the middle of a conversation about next steps and legal timing. I remember those words clearly. Next steps. Legal timing. I reached for the water glass in front of me. My hand was steady. That surprised me, because inside, something had already started to move. Not panic, not anger, just awareness. His father cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward, like he was about to address a board meeting instead of his own family. As most of you already know, he said, glancing around the table, deliberately skipping over me, "We've finalized the transition structure for the company assets." I kept my eyes on my plate. I didn't react. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already understood. I had seen the documents 2 days earlier, not because anyone showed me, because they had been left open on Kareem's laptop. I hadn't gone looking for anything. I was just trying to send an email, and there it was. A draft agreement. Names. Signatures pending. Dates. And one very clear absence. Mine. I didn't confront him that night. I closed the laptop, went into the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I remember looking at my hands, just sitting there. That was the moment I knew something was already in motion. And I wasn't part of it. Back at the table, his mother gave a small, polite smile to the others. "We wanted to keep things simple," she added. "No complications." Complications. That word stayed with me. I took a slow sip of water and placed the glass back down exactly where it had been. Nobody asked me if I had questions. Nobody explained anything. They moved forward as if I wasn't there. And I let them. Not because I didn't care, but because I needed to understand exactly how far they were willing to go without me. Dinner continued like that. Conversations flowed around me, over me, past me. Property distributions. Equity transfers. Future leadership roles. Every now and then, someone would glance in my direction, almost like they remembered I existed, and then quickly look away again. At one point, Kareem finally spoke directly to me. He didn't turn fully, just slightly. "You're quiet," he said. I remember exactly how his voice sounded. Casual. Almost careful. I nodded once. "I'm listening." That was all I said. Because I was. I was listening to every detail. Every word they assumed I wouldn't understand. Every decision they assumed I couldn't affect. And most of all, every silence they used to erase me. There's a moment when you've been underestimated for long enough where things stop feeling personal. They start feeling structured, predictable. That night wasn't sudden. It wasn't random. It was the result of years. Years of being introduced as Kareem's wife without anything else attached. Years of polite nods when I spoke, followed by complete dismissal once I stopped. Years of hearing, "That's nice," whenever I mentioned my work. Years of watching them respect titles, money, and visibility, while ignoring everything that didn't fit their idea of importance. I didn't fit their idea of importance. And that was fine, because they never actually asked who I was. Dinner ended with soft laughter and the sound of chairs sliding back against the floor. People stood up, adjusting jackets, finishing drinks, already moving on. His mother walked past me and gently touched the back of my chair. "You understand, don't you?" she said. That tone, that soft, Polished tone people use when they think they're being reasonable. I looked up at her. Yes, I said. And I meant it. I did understand. Just not in the way she thought. Kareem came over a few minutes later. We didn't want to overwhelm you, he said quietly. It's complicated. I stood up slowly and smoothed my dress. I know, I said. And then I picked up my phone from the table and slipped it into my bag. He waited, like he expected more. An argument. A question. A reaction. But I didn't give him one, because reacting too early would have helped them. And I wasn't going to do that. Not this time. We drove home in silence. The city lights moved across the windshield in soft reflections, and I watched them without really seeing anything. Kareem turned on the radio halfway through the drive. Low volume. Background noise. Avoidance. When we got home, he went straight into the living room. I walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to think clearly. Not emotionally. Clearly. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. Not his. Mine. There were emails I had saved, documents I had downloaded, screenshots I had taken 2 nights earlier without even fully realizing why. At the time, it had just felt necessary. Now it made sense. I opened the first file, read it again, then the second, then the third. I didn't rush. I didn't skip anything. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: when people decide you don't matter, they stop being careful, and that's when the truth becomes visible. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. Not angry. Not yet. Just certain. That dinner wasn't the moment everything changed. It was the moment everything became clear. And clarity changes the way you move. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay down without saying a word to him. Because I already knew. The next time we sat at a table together, it wouldn't be the same. And they wouldn't be controlling the conversation anymore. That part was already over. I just hadn't shown them yet. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset in the way people expect. There were no tears. No pacing. No replaying arguments in my head. It was quieter than that. More methodical. I lay there and let everything settle into place. And when it did, I started seeing the pattern more clearly than I ever had before. Because that dinner didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years. I met Kareem when I was 29. We were introduced through a mutual friend at a small networking event. He was confident, well-spoken, the kind of person who always seemed to know exactly what to say. I remember he asked me what I did. Not in a dismissive way. Genuinely. I work in regulatory compliance, I told him. He nodded like he understood. But he didn't ask anything else. And at the time, I didn't think much of it. Most people don't. It's not a job that sounds impressive unless you already know what it means. And that was fine with me. I've never needed my work to sound impressive. I needed it to be solid. We got married about a year later. His family was polite. That's the word people use when they don't want to say more. They were always composed, always appropriate, always measured. But there was a distance. I noticed it early. The way conversations would shift slightly when I spoke. The way questions about my work would stay surface level. The way they focused on visible things: titles, income brackets, public recognition. And I didn't offer any of that. Not visibly. So over time, I became background. Not excluded outright. Just not considered central. His mother, especially, had a very particular way of framing things. She liked to categorize people. Who was useful? Who was reliable? Who was presentable? And who was not necessary. I don't think she ever said those words directly, but you could hear it in the way she spoke. Amina prefers to keep things simple, she would say. Or, Amina's work is quite technical, it's not really relevant here. Or my personal favorite, said once during a larger family gathering. She's very quiet, easy to manage. I remember exactly when she said that. I was standing 2 steps away, holding a tray of teacups. I didn't react. I just set the tray down and walked back into the kitchen. That's how most of it went. Small things. Consistent things. Enough to shape how they saw me. And eventually, how they treated me. Kareem noticed some of it. but not all. And when he did notice, he would smooth it over. They don't mean anything by it, he'd say. They're just used to a certain way of doing things. Or the one I heard the most, you're overthinking it. I stopped explaining after a while. Not because I agreed with him, but because explaining didn't change anything. And I had other things to focus on. My work. That part of my life stayed separate. Very intentionally. I worked with a firm that handled compliance audits for mid to large financial institutions. Mostly quiet work. Behind the scenes. Documentation. Risk analysis. Regulatory frameworks. The kind of work people only notice when something goes wrong. But within that space, I was not invisible. I led projects, reviewed high-risk portfolios, signed off on regulatory submissions that carried real consequences. There were meetings where my name mattered, rooms where people listened when I spoke, situations where precision wasn't optional. And over time, I built a reputation, not publicly, but internally, the kind that doesn't need attention, just accuracy, reliability, trust. I never talked about it much at home, not because I was hiding anything, but because there was never space for it. Every time I tried, it would get simplified, or redirected, or politely dismissed. That sounds complicated. I'm sure it's stressful. Well, at least it's stable. So I stopped bringing it up. And they stopped asking. That's how it works. People assume your value based on what they see. And if they don't look closely, they fill in the blanks themselves. Over time, I became the quiet one, the simple one, the one who doesn't get involved, which made things easier for them, because it meant they didn't have to consider me when decisions were made. That pattern became especially clear after Kareem joined his father's company. It was a family business, established, structured. Everything ran through a central ownership system, shares, directorships, control mechanisms. And slowly, conversations about the future started happening more often. At first, I wasn't included because it wasn't finalized yet. Then because it wasn't the right time. Then because it was too complex. And eventually, I just wasn't included at all. But I noticed things. Small details. Shifts in tone. New documents left on the table. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I didn't question it directly. I observed. Because asking prematurely would have only closed things off further, and I needed to see the full picture. 2 days before that dinner, I got it. Kareem had left his laptop open on the dining table. That wasn't unusual. He worked from home a lot. I sat down to send an email, and the screen was already active. A document open. A draft agreement. I didn't move right away. I just looked. Then I scrolled. Names. His father. His brother, 2 external advisors, ownership percentages, asset allocations, timeline, and then a clause. Very clear, very intentional. Spousal exclusion from voting authority. I read it twice, slowly, then again, because sometimes your brain tries to correct what it's seeing, tries to soften it, but this was precise. Legal language doesn't leave much room for interpretation. I didn't feel shock. That's the part people don't understand. When something confirms what you've already been sensing, it doesn't hit suddenly. It settles. I took a screenshot, then another. Then I downloaded the document, closed everything exactly how I found it, and sent my email. Like nothing had happened. That night, I didn't mention it. The next day, I watched, listened, waited, and then came the dinner, the name card, the seating. The conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. It all aligned perfectly. That's when I knew. This wasn't accidental. It was structured, planned, agreed upon. And most importantly, they believed I wouldn't notice. Or if I did, that I wouldn't understand it well enough to matter. That assumption stayed with me more than anything else. Not the exclusion. Not the conversation. The assumption. Because that's where people make their biggest mistakes. Not in what they do, but in what they believe you're capable of seeing. The next morning, I woke up before Kareem, made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop again. My files, my records, my notes. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was verifying, cross-checking, understanding exactly what had been set up and what it meant, not emotionally, but structurally. Because once you understand the structure, you understand where the leverage is. And I was starting to see it. Not fully yet, but enough to know this wasn't going to end the way they expected. I closed the last document and looked out the window. The street was quiet, normal, unchanged. But inside, something had already shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough. And that was all I needed, because from that point on, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. I didn't confront anyone that week. Not Kareem. Not his parents. Not even indirectly. And that wasn't hesitation. It was timing. Because once you speak too early, people adjust. They rewrite. They protect themselves. I wasn't going to give them that chance. Instead, I did something much simpler. I stepped back. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone could point to. Just enough. I stopped asking about the company. Stopped sitting in on their casual updates. Stopped offering small suggestions the way I used to, even when they weren't asked for. I became exactly what they already believed I was. Uninvolved. And once that happened, they became even less careful. That's when things started opening up. Kareem began taking more calls in the living room instead of stepping outside. He assumed I wasn't paying attention. I didn't look up from what I was doing, but I listened. Names, dates, law firms, deadlines. At one point, I heard him say, "No, she doesn't need to be part of that. It's already handled." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't have to. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, a courier delivered a sealed envelope addressed to him. It was left on the hallway table. He was in the shower. I walked past it once, then again, and then I stopped. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The return address was enough. A legal firm I recognized. Not from his world. From mine. I had seen their name on compliance filings more than once, which meant this wasn't just internal planning anymore. It was moving into formal execution. That was important, because internal decisions can still shift. Formal filings don't. That afternoon, I went into my office and started pulling my own records. Not their documents. Mine. Anything connected to the company that had passed through my hands over the last 3 years. Because while they had been excluding me socially, they hadn't realized something else. At the beginning of our marriage, Kareem had asked me to just take a look at some internal structures. Nothing official. Just informal reviews. I remember he said, "You understand this stuff better than we do." And he was right. At the time, I treated it casually. A few notes here. A few suggestions there. Nothing signed. Nothing formal. But I kept copies. That's habit. Not suspicion. In my line of work, you don't rely on memory. You rely on records. And those records told a very clear story. Gaps in compliance. Unregistered transfers. Structural shortcuts that hadn't been corrected. At the time, I had flagged them. Quietly. Professionally. They had nodded. Said they would look into it. And then, nothing changed. Back then, I let it go. Because it wasn't my responsibility. And I wasn't part of the company. At least, not officially. Now that same gap meant something else. Because the agreement they were drafting relied on everything being clean, documented, compliant. And it wasn't. Not fully. I didn't rush. I didn't jump to conclusions. I verified everything, line by line, cross-referenced filings, checked dates, reviewed prior submissions. What I found wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough. Enough to delay. Enough to complicate. Enough to require correction before anything could move forward legally. And most importantly, enough to make someone credible in the room necessary. Not socially credible, technically credible. That distinction matters. I leaned back in my chair and closed the file. For a moment, I just sat there, not thinking, just letting it settle, because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point emotionally. It was about understanding the position I was in. And for the first time since that dinner, I could see it clearly. They had built a plan assuming I was irrelevant. But the structure they were relying on had already passed through me. and they hadn't realized it. That's the risk of underestimating someone. You stop tracking where they've been. That evening, Kareem came into the kitchen while I was making tea. He stood there for a moment, watching me. "You've been distant," he said. I didn't turn right away. I poured the tea, placed the spoon on the tray. Then I looked at him. "Have I?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yeah, a little." I nodded slowly. "Just busy." That was all. No accusation. No edge. Just enough to close the conversation. He studied my face for a second, like he was trying to read something. Then he let it go. "All right," he said, and walked out. That's how it works when people are comfortable with their assumptions. They don't push too hard, because they believe they already understand you. That night, I didn't open my laptop. I didn't review anything. I just sat in the living room with the lights dimmed and thought about timing. Not if I would act, but when. Because there's a difference between knowing something and revealing it in a way that matters. If I had confronted Kareem alone, it would have turned into a conversation. A private one. Contained. Manageable. He could deny. Delay. Reframe. But if the issue surfaced in the right room, with the right people, at the right moment, then it wouldn't be a conversation anymore. It would be a situation. And situations are harder to control. 3 days later, Kareem mentioned something over breakfast. "We have a meeting on Thursday," he said casually. "Final review before everything gets signed." I kept my expression neutral. "With the lawyers?" I asked. "Yeah." He took a sip of his coffee. "Small group. Just family and advisors." "Of course." I nodded once. "Sounds important." "It is." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You don't need to come. It'll be long and technical." I remember that word. Technical. I almost smiled, but I didn't. "That's fine," I said. And I meant it. Because I wasn't planning to be invited. I was planning something else. After he left, I cleared the table slowly, rinsed the cups, wiped the counter. Normal things. But my mind was already structured. Thursday. Final review. Before signing. That meant documentation would be presented. Assumptions confirmed. Everything aligned. Or not. I dried my hands and walked into my office. Opened my laptop. And started preparing a file. Not a long one. Not dramatic. Just precise. Specific points. Reference sections. Supporting documents attached. Clear enough that it couldn't be dismissed. Simple enough that it couldn't be misunderstood. I read through it twice. Then closed it. Saved it. And didn't send it. Not yet. Because timing was everything. Thursday morning came quietly. Kareem left early. Suit pressed. Folder in hand. Confident. Unquestioning. He didn't ask what I was doing that day. And I didn't offer. After the door closed, I waited. Not long. Just enough. Then I picked up my phone. Opened my contacts. And called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. He answered on the third ring. "Amina." His voice hadn't changed. Still direct. Still measured. "Good morning," I said. There was a brief pause. "Is everything all right?" I looked at the file open on my screen. "Yes," I said. Then I added, calmly, "I think there's something you'll want to see before today's meeting." Silence. Not confusion. Attention. "What kind of something?" he asked. I didn't rush. Something that affects the validity of what's about to be signed. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, send it. I closed my eyes for a second. Not out of doubt. Just acknowledgement. Because this was the moment. The shift. The line you cross when you stop observing and start allowing the truth to surface. "I will," I said. "And I'll be there as well." That part surprised him. I could hear it in his voice. "Are you expected?" I picked up my bag from the chair beside me. "No," I said. Then I paused, just briefly. But I think it's time I was. I ended the call. Stood there for a second. Then picked up my keys. Because sometimes you don't need to be invited. You just need to arrive at the right moment. And let the room adjust around you. I arrived 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. The office building was exactly how I remembered it from the few times I had been there years ago. Glass entrance, quiet reception, controlled environment. The kind of place where everything feels deliberate. I gave my name at the front desk. The receptionist hesitated for half a second, then checked something on her screen. Yes, she said. You're cleared to go up. That told me enough. He had already seen the file. The elevator ride was quiet. I stood alone, watching the numbers change, holding my bag steadily at my side. No nerves. Just focus. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the conference floor. I could already hear voices behind the glass doors at the end of the hallway. Measured. Confident. Controlled. I walked toward them without rushing, and then I opened the door. The room went still. Not completely silent, but enough. 12 people. Same number as the dinner. Kareem was seated on the right side of the table, mid-conversation. His father at the head. 2 lawyers on the left. His brother next to him. And at the far end, an empty chair. No name card. I noticed that immediately. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Kareem turned fully in his seat. Amina, he said. Not angry. Not welcoming. Just unprepared. I nodded once. Good morning. My voice was calm. Even. Like I belonged there. Because I did. His mother's expression tightened slightly. Not confusion. Recognition. She understood faster than the others. That shift in her face told me she had already connected something. One of the lawyers stood halfway, uncertain. I don't believe he started. Before he could finish, the man I had called earlier spoke. Let her sit. His voice was firm, authoritative, no hesitation. He was seated near the center, slightly back from the main line of discussion. Senior partner. I had worked with him on 2 cases years ago. He knew exactly what I did, and more importantly, what I didn't miss. That changed the room immediately. I walked to the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down. No one stopped me. No one offered anything, which was fine. I didn't need permission. The documents were already in front of them. Printed, highlighted, organized. He had moved quickly. That told me how seriously he took it. Kareem looked from me to the papers, then back again. What is this? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed my own copy of the file on the table. Opened it. Turned it toward them. Page 3, I said calmly. No explanation. Just direction. The senior partner picked it up first. His eyes moved quickly. Focused. Then he looked at Kareem's father. You weren't aware of this? He asked. There was a pause. A real one. Not controlled. Not polished. Kareem's father frowned slightly. What exactly are we looking at? He asked. His tone was still composed. But there was a shift. Less certainty. The lawyer on the left leaned in, scanning the page. His expression changed almost immediately. He flipped to the next page. Then the next. Then he stopped. Looked up. This hasn't been disclosed, he said. Not loudly, but clearly. The room tightened. Kareem straightened in his chair. What hasn't been disclosed? He asked. I watched him carefully. Not emotionally. Just observing. The lawyer tapped the document. These transfers here, he said. They were never properly registered. And this structure, he paused, flipping back. It conflicts with the filing from last year. Silence. Then Kareem's brother leaned forward. That's not possible, he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Because he hadn't checked. They hadn't checked. They had assumed. The senior partner turned to me. You verified this? He asked. Yes, I said. Simple. No elaboration. He nodded once. Then looked back at the others. This can't move forward as it stands, he said. That was it. That sentence changed everything. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just final. Kareem turned toward me fully now. His expression was different. Not confusion anymore. Something sharper. You went through our documents? He asked. There was an edge in his voice. Careful. Controlled. But there. I met his eyes. I reviewed the sections that directly affect the structure being signed today, I said. No apology. No defensiveness. Just clarity. His mother spoke then. This wasn't your place, she said. Still calm. Still polished. But tighter now. I didn't respond to her immediately. Instead, I looked at the table. at the documents, at the signatures waiting at the bottom of the pages. Then I looked back up. If it wasn't my place, I said quietly, it shouldn't have affected me. That landed. Not loudly, but clearly. The room shifted again. The second lawyer cleared his throat. We need to pause this, he said. At minimum, this requires review and correction before anything can be executed. Kareem's father leaned back slightly. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. Not lost, but recalculating. How long, he asked. The lawyer didn't hesitate. Weeks. Possibly longer, depending on what else surfaces. That word. Surfaces. It hung in the room. Because now, they didn't know what else they had missed. And that uncertainty is what changes control. Kareem stood up abruptly. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. He looked at me. You could have come to me. There it was. The private solution. The contained version. I shook my head slightly. I did, I said. He frowned. No, you didn't. I held his gaze. I raised these issues 2 years ago, I said. Informally. You said you'd handle it. Silence. Not denial. Memory. He remembered. I could see it. Small notes. Emails. Comments he had brushed past. At the time, they didn't matter. Now they did. The senior partner closed the file. We're not assigning blame right now, he said. We're addressing risk. That word shifted everything again. Risk. Because now it wasn't personal. It was structural. Professional. Real. He turned to Kareem's father. We proceed carefully from here. Nothing gets signed until this is resolved. No one argued. Not really. Because there was nothing to argue with. The facts were clean. The documentation was clear. And most importantly, the room had seen it. That's what mattered. Not what I said. Not how I said it. But that it was visible. Kareem sat back down slowly. His jaw tight. His hands still. He didn't look at me again. Not then. The meeting didn't end immediately. But the tone had changed completely. No more confidence. No more forward movement. Just review. Questions. Quiet conversations between lawyers. Rechecking. Reframing. I stayed seated. I didn't lead. I didn't explain further. I had already done what I needed to do. After about 20 minutes, the senior partner stood. We'll reconvene once this is assessed properly, he said. That was the end. Chairs moved. Papers gathered. Voices lowered. People avoiding direct eye contact. Not with each other. With me. His mother passed behind me on her way out. She didn't stop. Didn't speak. But I could feel it. That shift. That recalibration. I stood up slowly. Collected my file. Closed my bag. Kareem was still at the table. He finally looked up as I turned to leave. Amina, he said. I paused. Not turning fully. Just enough. We'll talk later, he added. I nodded once. Of course. And then I walked out. Calm. Unhurried. Because I wasn't leaving as the person they had seated at the end of the table. That version of me was already gone. And they knew it. Even if they didn't say it yet. Kareem didn't come home until late that night. I had already eaten. The kitchen was clean. The lights were dim. I was sitting on the sofa with my laptop closed beside me, not working, just there. When he walked in, he didn't say anything at first. He took off his jacket slowly, placed his keys on the table, stood there for a moment like he was deciding where to begin. Then he looked at me. You embarrassed us today. His voice was controlled, lower than usual, not angry in the way people expect, but tight. I met his eyes. I corrected something that needed to be corrected, I said. He exhaled sharply. You did it in front of everyone. Yes, I said, because that was the point. He ran a hand over his face and looked away for a second. You could have handled it differently. There it was again. The version where I stayed quiet, where I protected their structure, where I kept everything contained. I shook my head slightly. I've handled things differently for years, I said. That didn't seem to matter. He didn't respond to that. Not immediately. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, poured himself water, and stood there drinking it like he needed time. When he came back, his tone had shifted. Less defensive. More uncertain. What happens now? He asked. It wasn't a question about the company. Not really. I understood that. They'll review everything, I said. Fix what needs to be fixed. Restructure if necessary. And us? He asked quietly. That part. I had already thought about. Not emotionally. Clearly. We need to be honest about something, I said. He waited. You made decisions that directly affect me, I continued, and you did it without including me. Not because you had to. Because you assumed you could. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. Because there wasn't a clean response to that. I didn't think, he started. I know, I said. And I did. That was the problem. He hadn't thought about it. Not seriously. Not completely. Because in his mind, I wasn't part of that level of decision-making. And that belief had consequences. We didn't argue that night. There was no shouting. No escalation. Just a quiet conversation that didn't try to fix everything at once. Because some things you don't fix in one night. Over the next few days, things moved quickly on their side. Too quickly. That's what happens when a system you thought was stable suddenly isn't. I started getting messages. First from Kareem's brother. Short. Direct. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Then from his mother. More careful. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I read it once. Then put my phone face down. Because there wasn't a misunderstanding. There was a structure. And it had been exposed. 2 days later, one of the lawyers called me directly. Not casually. Formally. We'd like your input on a few things, he said. I almost smiled at that. Not out of satisfaction. Just recognition. Because now my role had changed. Not socially. Functionally. I'll review what you send, I said. Nothing more. No offer. No eagerness. Just boundaries. That's something I had learned slowly over the years. If you step in too quickly after being dismissed, people assume they can return to the same pattern. I wasn't going to do that. So I reviewed documents, made notes, sent back precise responses. No extra commentary. No emotion. Just clarity. And every time I did, the tone shifted further. Emails became more careful, more respectful. Meetings were scheduled properly. Not implied. Not assumed. Kareem watched all of this quietly. He didn't interrupt. Didn't try to take control. Because now, he could see the difference. Not in what I was doing, but in how it was being received. One evening, about a week later, he sat down across from me at the dining table. No documents this time. No phones. Just us. I didn't know, he said. I looked at him. I know, I replied. He nodded slowly. I should have asked more questions, he added. That mattered more than an apology. Because it showed understanding. Not just reaction. We didn't resolve everything in that moment. But something shifted. On both sides. Not back to what it was. Forward. Differently. As for his family, things didn't go back to normal. Not immediately. And not completely. His mother didn't call again after that message. But I saw the change in how she spoke to me when we were in the same room later. Careful. Measured in a different way. Not dismissive anymore. Just aware. His father kept his distance for a while. Then, eventually, he asked for a meeting. Not a family dinner. A meeting. That alone said enough. We sat in his office. Just the two of us. And for the first time since I had known him, he asked questions. Direct ones. About structure. About compliance. About risk. I answered them. Clearly. Without over-explaining. Because now, he was actually listening. That's all it takes sometimes. Not a loud moment. Not a confrontation. Just a shift in attention. The company took longer to stabilize than they expected. Corrections. Refilings. Legal adjustments. All of it slowed things down. But it also cleaned things up. And that mattered. Because rushed systems break. Correct ones last. As for me, I didn't change everything. I didn't walk away dramatically. I didn't cut everyone off. I just adjusted my place. I stopped sitting at the end of the table. Not physically, but structurally. I chose when to engage, when to step back, what to accept, what to decline, and most importantly, what not to fix for them anymore. Because that had been part of the pattern. I had been quietly correcting things for years, without recognition, without authority, without protection. That part ended. A few months later, we had another family dinner. Same table, same setting, but different atmosphere. There were name cards again. Mine was placed properly, aligned, centered. I noticed it. Of course I did, but I didn't react. I just sat down, calmly, like it had always been that way, because that's the thing about quiet changes. When they finally happen, you don't need to announce them. Everyone already knows. Dinner that night was normal. Conversation flowed. No tension. No careful avoidance. Just different. At one point, Kareem's mother asked me something. A real question. About a regulatory change she had heard mentioned. I answered. Briefly. She nodded. And didn't redirect the conversation. That was enough. After dinner, as I stood by the window with a cup of tea, I realized something. Nothing about that situation had required me to become louder, or sharper, or more aggressive. It only required me to stop accepting a version of myself that wasn't true, and to let the truth be seen in the right place, at the right time, by the right people. That's all. I still visit that same dining room, sit at the same table, have conversations with the same people, but it feels different now, not because they changed completely, but because I did. And once that happens, everything else adjusts around it, quietly,